Hello everyone, have a nice day. Today we'll join Jack and Tu Tien at Mrs. Loy's house for a warm dinner that suddenly turns intense when one question changes everything. Between caring hands, quiet promises, and the pressure of being ready, you'll feel how love can be comforting and still frightening. If you find it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. The warm dinner table went silent so suddenly that Tu Tien could hear the smallest sounds of chopsticks settling on porcelain, soup steaming, the faint crackle of the kitchen light. Mrs. Loy's question didn't feel loud. It didn't need to be. So, when are you two planning the wedding? Tu Tien froze mid-bite, her throat tightening as if the word wedding carried a weight she wasn't ready to lift. Across from her, Jack's hand paused above her bowl, still holding the serving spoon, like even the act of giving her food had been interrupted by that single sentence. Jack turned his head slowly toward Tu Tien first, not his mother. His eyes asked, "Are you okay? Do you want me to answer? Do you want me to stop this?" Tu Tien couldn't speak yet. The warmth in the room suddenly felt too bright against the cold places inside her. Mrs. Loy watched her closely, expression soft but unwavering, a mother who had already seen love become fragile and who refused to let it stay unspoken. Jack finally set the spoon down with controlled calm. "Mom," he said gently, "don't pressure her." Mrs. Loy's lips pressed together. "Pressure?" she repeated, almost offended, then her voice softened again. "Jack, I'm asking with love. I'm asking because I want her protected. Officially, publicly, not just in your arms when no one is watching." Tu Tien's fingers slid up to her collarbone without thinking. The simple chain Jack had bought earlier brushed her skin, and the tiny touch made her eyes sting. It wasn't the necklace that made her emotional. It was what it represented: being seen, being claimed, being loved out loud. She forced air into her lungs and finally spoke, small and honest. I want that too," Tu Tien whispered. "But sometimes I still feel scared. Like, I don't deserve a wedding or happiness." The moment she said it, the room felt heavier, not with judgment, but with truth. Mrs. Loy's face softened completely. She leaned forward and reached across the table, covering Tu Tien's hand with her own, warm, strong, unshaking. "Listen to me," Mrs. Loy said, voice steady. "Happiness isn't something you deserve. It's something you accept when it finally arrives." Tu Tien's lashes trembled. She blinked fast, trying not to cry at the dinner table like a child. Jack's gaze stayed on Tu Tien, as if she was the only person in the room. "We'll do it when you're ready," he said quietly. "Not when the world demands it, but..." His voice dipped, raw. "I do want a wedding with you, more than anything." Tu Tien nodded once, slowly, as if nodding was the only safe way to answer. Tears gathered anyway. "Then, give me a little time," she murmured. "I want to be strong when I walk into that day." Mrs. Loy's eyes shone. "Good," she said, relieved but firm. "Then we'll plan slowly, no rushing, but also no running away." A small laugh broke the tension. Jack's, quiet and breathy, the kind of laugh that comes when you realize you almost lost something precious in the space of a question. But Tu Tien still felt her heartbeat in her throat, and the chain at her neck felt heavier than before. Because now it wasn't just a gift, It was a countdown. Earlier that evening, the warmth had been immediate the moment they arrived. Mrs. Ly opened the door with an apron tied over her dress, her hands wiping on the fabric as if she'd been cooking nonstop just to keep her worry busy. "Finally," she said, half scolding, half smiling. "I was about to drag you both home myself." Her eyes swept over Jack first, checking he looked healthy, checking he was steady, then landed on Tu Tien and stopped. The necklace caught the light when Tu Tien moved. Ly's eyebrows lifted. Her teasing voice came out before she could hide her delight. "Oh, new necklace? Jack, you're learning fast." Tu Tien's cheeks flushed. She lifted a hand as if to hide it, then realized that would only draw more attention. "Mrs. Ly," she murmured, embarrassed. Instead of teasing further, Mrs. Ly stepped forward and pulled Tu Tien into a hug so natural it felt like it had always existed. "How are you feeling lately?" Mrs. Ly asked, her voice right near Tu Tien's ear. "Any itching? Any coughing? Sleeping well?" Tu Tien pulled back slightly, surprised by the careful questions. "I'm better," she said. "I've been resting, and I've been working in the garden." "Good," Mrs. Ly said immediately. Then her tone sharpened with love. "But don't overdo it. If you feel anything strange, you tell me first. Don't hide." Jack stood just behind Tu Tien's shoulder, listening. He didn't interrupt. He simply nodded once, like Mrs. Ly had spoken a rule he'd been trying to live by since the day Tu Tien came back into his arms. They moved to the dinner table. The food looked simple, but had abundant soup, vegetables, meat, and warm rice. The kind of meal that didn't try to impress, only to comfort. Tu Tien sat down carefully, posture polite. Jack sat beside her by instinct, not across from her like he wanted to stay close enough to catch any tremor in her breathing. Mrs. Ly watched them as she served the soup. Her eyes were sharp, not with suspicion, but with attention. "You two look," she began, then hesitated as if searching for the right words. "More stable, more like a real couple now." Tu Tien lowered her gaze. Jack calmly served her food first, the way he always did, like her needs came before his appetite. The warmth of the room wrapped around them, and for a moment, Tu Tien believed she could breathe freely. Then Mrs. Ly cleared her throat, and the warmth became a spotlight. "So," she said, gently but directly, "when are you two planning the wedding?" Tu Tien's spoon stopped in midair. Jack's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in protectiveness. And outside the window, the night wind pushed softly against the glass like a reminder. Even the safest rooms still have doors. Jack's phone vibrated once in his pocket, short, sharp. He didn't check it. But his eyes flickered toward the hallway for a split second, as if some part of him sensed a shadow moving closer. Tu Tien noticed. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table, and the warm dinner so full of love suddenly felt like the start of something they weren't ready to name yet. Tu Tien tried to swallow, but her throat stayed tight. The room was warm, too warm, like the air itself was pressing against her chest. Mrs. Ly had meant the question as love. Jack had answered with patience. And still, Tu Tien felt exposed, as if the word wedding had peeled back the quiet layers she'd been using to survive. Jack's hand slid closer on the table, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. Tu Tien let her fingers rest against his, and the simple touch steadied her more than any speech could. Mrs. Ly exhaled slowly, as if she was choosing her next words carefully. "I'm not trying to rush you," she said. I've seen what fear does. It makes people delay their happiness until it's too late." Tu Tien's eyes flicked up. "Too late?" Mrs. Loi's gaze softened, turning distant for a second, like she was remembering a pain she never fully shared. Then she looked back at Tu Tien, present again. "I want you to have memories that are bright," Mrs. Loi said quietly, "not just memories of running." The word running hit Tu Tien hard. She lowered her gaze, fingertips moving to the chain at her neck. The necklace felt colder now, as if it knew it had become part of a bigger story. Jack spoke carefully, voice low. "She's not running," he said. "She's healing." Mrs. Loi nodded. "I know, and I'm proud of her. But healing doesn't mean you can't be loved loudly, too." Tu Tien's lips parted, and for a moment, the truth almost came out the way it lived inside her. "I'm afraid if we announce our happiness, someone will hear it. Someone will come." Instead, she forced herself to meet Mrs. Loi's eyes. "I want a wedding," Tu Tien said. Her voice was small but firm. "But I want it to feel safe, not like a performance, not like a target." Jack's fingers tightened around hers for half a second, a silent agreement. Mrs. Loi didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss it. She studied Tu Tien's face like she was reading between every word. "Then we do it your way," Mrs. Loi said. "Small, close, simple, but real." Tu Tien's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. Jack's shoulders loosened, like someone had finally stopped trying to pull them apart with expectations. "We'll plan slowly," Jack said. "Step by step." Mrs. Loi nodded, then tried to lighten the moment with a softer tone. "Good, because I've already been collecting ideas in my head, not forcing, just hoping." A fragile smile appeared on Tu Tien's face, and for the first time that night, the warmth returned to the room. They ate again more quietly now, but not in fear, in something closer to peace. Jack served Tu Tien more soup. She ate it. Mrs. Loi asked about the garden. Tu Tien explained how she wanted to move the cabbage rows to make a cleaner walking path near the gate. Jack listened like those small plans were sacred. And maybe they were, because life doesn't rebuild itself in dramatic moments. It rebuilds itself in dinners, in questions, in hands held under the table. Then Jack's phone vibrated again, 2 short pulses this time. His face didn't change much, but Tu Tien felt the shift immediately. Jack's attention turned sharp, like a blade being lifted. Loi noticed too. "Jack?" she asked. Jack forced a calm expression. "It's nothing, probably the sight." He didn't check the phone at the table. Not yet, but his eyes slid toward the window, then the front door, measuring distance, listening for sound. Tu Tien's stomach tightened. The warmth of dinner suddenly felt fragile, like glass. When they finally stood to leave, Mrs. Loi walked Tu Tien to the door and adjusted the collar of her sweater, gently, motherly. "Remember," Mrs. Loi whispered, "no hiding. If you feel afraid, you speak. You don't carry it alone." Tu Tien nodded, throat burning. "I will." Outside, the night air was cool. Jack helped Tu Tien onto the motorbike, his hand steady at her waist for a second longer than usual. As soon as they pulled away from the house, Jack finally glanced at his phone at a red light. Tu Tien saw his eyes narrow just slightly. "What is it?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jack locked the screen without showing her. His jaw clenched. Then he softened his tone for her. "Nothing you need to worry about right now," he said. "Just stay close to me." The light turned green. They rode into the dark road back to the farm, Tutien's hand resting on her chain as if it could protect her. Behind them, far back, a motorbike engine started, then matched their speed. And the warm dinner they just left behind suddenly felt like a dream that the night was trying to steal.
Welcome by going through even when you're concerned. Miss Ly notices Tutien's simple, relentless, and asks careful questions about her health, urging her not to hit any pain. The dinner feels safe until Miss Ly gently asks the question that freezes the room. When will they have a wedding? Tutien admits she wants one, but still fears she doesn't deserve happiness. And she is terrified that separating publicly could make them a target. Jack protests her without rushing, promising they will move forward and only when she feels ready and safe. Miss Ly surprised Tutien by agreeing to a small, quiet wedding, simple but real. The warmth returns, but it doesn't last. Jack's phone vibrates twice, his instincts sharpen, and on the dark road home, a motorbike seems to follow them.